I need a volunteer sniper. Right now. One shot, one chance, or this entire exercise is a failure. Lieutenant General Marcus Ashworth's voice cut across the training ground like a blade, silencing the murmurs of 50 assembled marksmen from 5 different nations. His 3 stars gleamed in the afternoon sun as he stood before the finest sniper teams the Western world could produce, and not a single one of them moved. The problem was simple in description and impossible in execution. A mechanical failure had repositioned the final qualification target at an angle that turned mathematics into mockery. 1,847 meters. Crosswinds gusting between 7 and 15 knots, shifting every 3 seconds with no discernible pattern. The computerized targeting systems had crashed 20 minutes ago, their screens showing nothing but error codes and the quiet hum of expensive failure. Someone needed to make the shot manually. Someone needed to save 2 weeks of international coordination and $4 million of NATO funding from collapsing into embarrassment. The Marine teams exchanged glances. The British SAS candidates studied their boots with sudden intensity. Even the legendary SEAL instructors who had flown in as observers remained frozen at the edge of the range, their arms crossed, their faces carefully neutral. 50 meters away, through the serving window of the base mess hall, a pair of ancient eyes watched the commotion unfold. Elias Rountree's arthritic hands paused over the massive pot of beef stew he had been stirring for the past hour. Steam rose around his weathered face, fogging the thick glasses perched on his nose. At 79 years old, his skin had the texture of leather left too long in the sun, deep creases mapping a geography of decades. White stubble covered his chin in patches he had missed while shaving that morning, and a hearing aid sat in his left ear, turned down low because the kitchen noise bothered him. Everyone on base called him Pop, the ones who noticed him at all. He watched the general's frustration mount through the window, watched the international observers begin to shift uncomfortably in their seats, watched the young Marines fail to meet their commander's eyes. Something stirred in his chest. Something he had buried a long time ago. The flags snapping at the edge of the range caught his attention. He studied them for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the distant hillside where thermals would be rising off the sun-baked rock. Then he calculated the corridor, the window, the single breath of calm that would appear in approximately 4 minutes if the pattern held. It would hold. It always held. Physics did not change its mind. Elias untied his apron. His hands trembled slightly as he hung it on the hook beside the industrial refrigerator. His orthopedic shoes squeaked against the tile floor as he shuffled toward the back door of the kitchen, moving with the slow, careful gait of a man whose joints had long ago filed formal complaints against movement of any kind. No one in the kitchen noticed him leave. He was the old cook. He was furniture. He was invisible. Outside, the afternoon heat pressed against him like a weight. He could feel the familiar ache in his left shoulder, the one that predicted weather changes better than any forecast. 2 bullets had lived there once, for 31 hours, before a field medic had dug them out with forceps and a prayer. The walk across the training ground took longer than it should have. His body resisted every step, screaming reminders of its age and limitations. But something else was waking up inside him, something that remembered a different way of moving, a different way of breathing, a different way of seeing the world. Before we continue this story, we would love to know where you are watching from today. Drop a comment below with your city or country. And if stories about hidden heroes and quiet legends speak to you, consider subscribing to our channel. You might have someone like Elias in your own community, someone whose humble appearance hides decades of extraordinary service. Now, let us continue. Staff Sergeant Decker noticed him first. Young, sharp-featured, with the eager aggression of a man who had something to prove and a career to build. He intercepted the old cook 10 meters from the range boundary, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone who had never been seriously questioned. "Sir, this area is restricted. The mess hall is back that way." Elias kept walking. His voice came out soft, almost a whisper roughened by decades of disuse. "I heard the general needs a shooter." Decker laughed. Not cruel, just reflexive. The way you might laugh at a child who announced they were going to fly to the moon. The Marines nearby heard the exchange, and several chuckled along. The old cook thinks he's going to shoot. The man can barely carry a serving tray without shaking. Sir, with all due respect, this is a military exercise. You need to return to your duty station. Elias stopped. He looked at Decker with eyes that had seen more death than this young staff sergeant had seen years of life. Something in that gaze made Decker's smile falter, just for a moment. I have been making that shot since before your father was born, son. The laughter spread now, rippling through the assembled teams. A British SAS candidate nudged his teammate. Even the SEAL observers exchanged amused glances. The tension of the failed exercise broke momentarily as everyone watched this bizarre scene unfold. Lieutenant General Ashworth turned from his position near the shooting station, his frustration redirecting toward this new interruption. His voice carried the weight of 3 decades of command. Someone get this man back to the kitchen. We do not have time for this. But Elias had already moved past Decker. He was walking toward the shooting position with a certainty that made several observers pause mid-breath. The shuffle was gone. His footsteps fell with measured precision, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. Master Sergeant Vivian Okafor, one of the Marine sniper instructors, watched the old cook approach. 20 years of training shooters had given her an eye for movement, for the subtle tells that separated pretenders from predators. Something nagged at her. She had seen men walk like that before. Men who had spent decades crawling through killing fields. Men whose bodies remembered violence the way other bodies remembered dancing. But what none of them knew, what none of them could possibly suspect, was that in exactly 3 minutes, the old cook in the stained apron would make a shot that would be studied at Quantico for the next 50 years. And every assumption they had made about the trembling hands and the shuffling feet and the quiet voice would shatter like glass against stone. The year was 1968, and the elephant grass rose high enough to swallow a manhole. 19-year-old Elias Roundtree lay motionless in that grass, his body pressed so flat against the Vietnamese soil that insects crawled across his back without registering him as human. 6 hours he had been there. 6 hours of controlled breathing, of ignoring the fire ants that had found the soft skin behind his ears, of watching through a scope as an NVA commander directed troop movements that would kill every man in Elias's platoon if someone did not stop them. His spotter lay beside him, a white kid from Alabama named Tommy Weston who had never met a black person before boot camp and who had become closer to Elias than any brother could ever be. Tommy's whisper was barely audible above the jungle sounds. Wind is shifting, Spectre. 2 clicks left. You got maybe a 3-second window when that cloud passes. Elias did not respond. He did not need to. His finger was already moving, his breathing already stopped, his entire existence narrowed to the crosshairs and the target and the mathematics of death. The shot traveled 1,100 meters. The NVA commander dropped before the sound reached him. The platoon lived. That was where it began. The legend that would grow through 3 wars and 4 decades, until it became something whispered about in briefing rooms and training facilities, something that new snipers heard about and dismissed as exaggeration until they met someone who had been there, who had seen it, who could not explain what they had witnessed. The memories came faster now, flooding through Elias's mind as he walked across the Fort Navarro training ground. Beirut in 1983, the aftermath of the barracks bombing, the screams of trapped Marines echoing through rubble that still smoked with the heat of explosion. He had climbed to a rooftop with a rifle and a canteen and nothing else, and he had held that position for 18 hours. Anyone who approached the rubble with hostile intent did not approach twice. When they finally pulled him down, his shoulder was shattered and his canteen was empty, and 47 Marines who should have died were being loaded onto medical helicopters instead. The Gulf War came next in his cascade of memory. The desert that stretched endless and beige in every direction. The heat that made the air shimmer like water. The operations so classified that even their commanding officers received briefings with more redactions than words. And beside him through all of it, his spotter, his brother, the man who had replaced Tommy Weston after Tommy caught a round in '72. Corporal Winston Tate, call sign Bishop. The best spotter Elias had ever known and the best friend he had ever had. Bishop had learned everything from Tommy before Tommy died, including the slow Alabama drawl that Tommy used when calling wind adjustments. It was a voice that had talked Elias through impossible shots in impossible conditions, a voice that had kept him sane during the long hours of waiting, a voice that had fallen silent on a February morning in 1991 when everything that mattered ended. The memory hit Elias like a physical blow, and his stride faltered for just a moment. They had been 400 meters from extraction, close enough to see the helicopters, close enough to taste safety. The ambush came from a building they had cleared twice. An RPG streaked across the morning light, and Bishop went down hard, his leg gone below the knee, his blood turning the sand dark. Elias tried to reach him. He tried with everything he had, every ounce of strength and training and desperate love. But the enemy fire was too heavy, pinning him behind a concrete barrier while he watched through his scope as his best friend bled out in the Iraqi sand. He could see Bishop's lips moving. He could see Bishop reaching for something around his neck. The rosary beads his grandmother had given him before deployment, the ones he touched before every shot, the ones he swore brought him luck. By the time air support cleared the enemy positions, Bishop was gone. His hand was still wrapped around those rosary beads, and his eyes were still fixed on the sky, and Elias was screaming his name from 400 meters away. 6 months later, Master Gunnery Sergeant Elias Roundtree retired from the United States Marine Corps. 31 years of service. More confirmed kills than any official record would ever show. More ghosts than any man should carry. They offered him everything. Training positions at Quantico, consulting contracts with agencies whose names were never spoken aloud, a comfortable retirement with full honors and a pension that would let him live like a king. He refused it all. He met Clara at a church pancake breakfast in 1994. She was a widow herself, a nurse who had spent 30 years watching people die and who recognized the weight that Elias carried without needing to ask about it. She never questioned his nightmares. She never pressed him about the scars. She just made him coffee every morning and held him when he woke up screaming and loved him in a way that made him believe he might deserve to keep living. 23 years they had together. 23 years of quiet mornings and evening walks in a small house with a garden where Elias grew tomatoes and tried to forget that his hands had ever held anything but seeds. When Clara died, the cancer taking her piece by piece over 18 months, the house became a mausoleum. Every room held her voice. Every corner held her memory. Every night alone in that bed was a night spent drowning in everything he had lost. He could not stay. He could not bear it. The job at Fort Navarro appeared in a veteran's newsletter. Kitchen staff needed. No experience required. On base housing available. Elias applied the same day. He needed to be near Marines again. He needed to hear the cadence of their voices, smell the gun oil and boot polish, feel the rhythm of military life, even if he could no longer be part of it. 12 years now. 12 years of invisibility. 12 years of being the old cook who made good biscuits and never said more than 10 words at a time. In his apron pocket, pressed against his hip with every step, Bishop's rosary beads clinked softly together. He had carried them for 33 years. He would carry them until he died. The shooting position was 20 meters ahead now. The assembled snipers watched him approach with expressions ranging from amusement to confusion to irritation. General Ashworth was saying something to an aide, gesturing sharply, clearly ordering someone to remove this interruption from his range. Elias did not slow down. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. The shuffle was gone completely now, replaced by the measured stride of a predator approaching its purpose. "Still here, brother," he whispered under his breath. "Still trying." Staff Sergeant Decker moved to intercept him again, stepping directly into his path with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged. "Sir, I'm not going to ask you again. This is a restricted military exercise. You need to return to your duty station immediately, or I will have you escorted off this range." Elias stopped. He looked at Decker the way a teacher might look at a student who had failed to grasp a basic concept. There was no anger in his expression, no defensiveness, just a patience that seemed to stretch back decades. I heard the general needs a shooter, son. I'm here to shoot. The laughter that rippled through the assembled teams was louder this time. A French commando elbowed his partner and said something in rapid-fire dialect that made both of them grin. The British SAS candidates shook their heads with the weary amusement of men watching a civilian wander onto a professional sports field. Decker's face hardened. He was not accustomed to being ignored, and this old man's quiet persistence was beginning to feel like disrespect. "Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice dropping to a tone he usually reserved for disciplinary situations. "I do not care how good your biscuits are. I do not care how long you have worked in a mess hall. This range is for qualified military personnel only, and you are neither qualified nor military. So you're going to turn around right now and walk back to your kitchen, or I'm going to have 2 MPs drag you there. Do you understand me?" Elias nodded slowly. His voice remained soft, almost gentle. "I understand you, Staff Sergeant. I also understand that target at 1,800 meters. I understand the wind shear coming off that hillside. I understand the thermal corridor that will open in approximately 90 seconds. And I understand that not a single shooter on this range has volunteered because they know the mathematics do not work in their favor." Decker blinked. The technical precision of the old man's words cut through his irritation like a blade through paper. Before he could respond, another voice joined the conversation. Master Sergeant Vivian Okafor had approached without either of them noticing, moving with the quiet competence of someone who had spent 2 decades learning how to read situations before they exploded. "Staff Sergeant," she said calmly. "Stand down." Decker turned to her with confusion written across his face. "Master Sergeant, this civilian is attempting to access a restricted area. Regulations clearly state that." I said stand down. Something in Okafor's tone made Decker's mouth close. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Elias, studying him the way she might study a rifle before trusting it with her life. 20 years of training snipers had taught her to see things that others missed. The way a person carried themselves, the way their eyes moved across an environment, the small unconscious habits that separated those who had killed from those who had only trained to kill. The old cook stood before her with hands that trembled slightly at his sides. His apron was still tied around his waist, stained with evidence of the morning's breakfast service. His orthopedic shoes were scuffed and worn. Everything about him screamed elderly civilian, harmless, out of place. But his eyes told a different story. They were tracking. Even as he stood still, even as he spoke to Decker, those ancient eyes were moving, scanning the tree line, noting the positions of the observers, calculating angles and distances with the automatic precision of someone who had spent a lifetime turning geography into firing solutions. Okafor had seen eyes like that before. Not often, not in many years, but she had seen them. General Ashworth pushed through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle. His patience had evaporated entirely, replaced by the cold fury of a commander watching his operation collapse into farce. "What in the name of God is happening here?" His voice carried the authority of 3 stars and 30 years. "Someone explain to me why we are standing around watching our cook wander across a live range, instead of solving the problem I presented 20 minutes ago." Sir Okafor said, her voice steady. "I believe we should let him attempt the shot." Ashworth turned to her with an expression of pure disbelief. "Master Sergeant, have you lost your mind?" "No, sir. But I have been training snipers for 2 decades, and something about this man is not what it appears to be." The general looked at Elias, looked at the trembling hands and the stained apron and the hearing aid and the thick glasses, looked at everything that screamed impossibility. "This is absurd," he said finally. "We have NATO observers watching. We have the finest shooters in the Western world standing right here. And you want me to hand a rifle to our mess hall cook?" Elias spoke before Okafor could respond. His voice cut through the tension like a wire through clay. "General, I am not asking for your rifle. I am not asking for your permission. I am asking for the opportunity to help. That target is at your 11 o'clock, 1,847 meters out. The wind is gusting between 7 and 15 from the east, with a thermal differential creating unpredictable corridors off the hillside. Your computerized systems are down, which means someone needs to calculate manually. I can make that calculation. I have been making that calculation since 1966. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ashworth stared at the old man. Something in those words, in the precise technical language, in the cold confidence of the delivery, had shifted something in his assessment. Since 1966, he repeated slowly, "Yes, sir." Elias met his gaze without flinching. Since a jungle in Vietnam, where I learned that mathematics does not care about age or appearance or what uniform you are wearing. Mathematics only cares about being correct. At the edge of the crowd, Master Chief Corbin of the Naval Special Warfare Command felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard stories. Everyone in the special operations community had heard stories about a Marine sniper so deadly that 3 different enemy nations had put bounties on his head, about a ghost who appeared and disappeared across 3 decades of conflict, leaving nothing behind but bodies and legends. They called him Spectre. Corbin pulled out his phone and began making a call. General Ashworth held Elias's gaze for a long moment. The training ground had gone completely silent. 50 of the world's finest marksmen holding their breath as a 3-star general and an elderly cook faced each other across an impossible divide. "Fine," Ashworth said finally. His voice carried the tone of a man who had decided to let someone hang themselves with their own rope. "One shot, old man. You miss, and you go back to the kitchen, and we never speak of this again. Understood?" Elias nodded once. "Understood, sir." He walked past the general toward the shooting station where an M40A6 lay waiting on its bipod. The rifle was the current standard for Marine Corps Scout snipers, a precision instrument capable of extraordinary accuracy in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. In the hands of a mess hall cook, it was simply an expensive piece of metal. Or so everyone assumed. Elias lowered himself to the ground beside the rifle. His knees protested audibly, cartilage grinding against bone in a symphony of age and deterioration. His back ached as he settled into the prone position, muscles that had not been asked to perform this task in over a decade, screaming their objections. But something else was happening as well, something that the observers could not see, but that Elias could feel in every fiber of his being. The tremor in his hands was fading. The fog that had clouded his mind for 12 years of grief and isolation was lifting. The old cook was disappearing, and someone else was taking his place. Someone who had never really left. Someone who had simply been waiting. He placed his cheek against the stock of the rifle and felt a shock of recognition run through his body. Different model, different era, but the same fundamental truth. The same cold steel against his face, the same weight in his hands, the same narrowing of the world to a single point of focus. Coming home. That was what it felt like. Coming home after a very long time away. Master Sergeant Okafor moved without conscious thought, dropping to her knees beside him and pulling her rangefinder to her eye. She did not know why she was doing this. Instinct had taken over, decades of training overriding her rational mind. "Talk to me," Elias said softly. The words came out differently than anything she had heard from the old cook before. The quiet deference was gone. The hesitant whisper was gone. This was a command voice, soft but absolute, expecting to be obeyed. "Target is at your 11 o'clock," Okafor heard herself say. "Range 1847 meters. Wind is variable, gusting 7 to 15 from the east. Temperature differential is creating thermals off the hillside, unpredictable intervals." Elias nodded slightly. His eye was already at the scope, his body already making the micro adjustments that separated professionals from amateurs. He could see the target now, a small steel plate positioned at an angle that made it nearly invisible from this distance. A cruel shot, a shot designed to test the absolute limits of human capability. He had made worse. Behind them, the assembled observers watched in silence. The French commandos had stopped smiling. The British SAS candidates were leaning forward with sudden intensity. Even Staff Sergeant Decker had gone quiet, his earlier mockery replaced by something he could not quite name. Master Chief Corbin stood at the edge of the crowd with his phone pressed to his ear. His contact at Quantico had put him on hold while they searched for records that required 3 levels of classification clearance to access. He watched the old cook settle into position and felt his certainty growing with every passing second. The way Elias held the rifle, the way his body had found its natural alignment without conscious adjustment, the way his breathing had slowed to an almost imperceptible rhythm. These are not things that could be learned from books or imitated from movies. These were the marks of someone who had spent decades behind a scope, someone whose body had been shaped by the rifle the way a river is shaped by its banks. General Ashworth stood with his arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. He had made his decision, and he would stand by it. Let the old man embarrass himself. Let the NATO observers see what happened when civilians wandered onto military ranges. It would be a useful lesson in the importance of protocol. But something was nagging at him, something in the way the cook had spoken about thermal differentials and wind corridors. Those were not terms that civilians used. Those were not concepts that someone picked up from watching war movies or reading Tom Clancy novels. In a prone position, Elias felt the world shrinking around him. The sounds of the observers faded. The heat of the afternoon sun disappeared. Even the ache in his joints became distant, irrelevant, belonging to someone else. There was only the rifle. There was only the target. There was only the wind. And there was Bishop, his voice rising from 33 years of memory, as clear as if he were lying beside Elias in the Vietnamese grass or the Lebanese rubble or the Iraqi sand. Wind is shifting, Spectre. You got about a 4-second window. Make it count, brother. Elias's finger moved to the trigger. Not yet. Not quite yet. The thermal corridor had not opened. The window had not appeared. But it would. In approximately 45 seconds, the physics would align, and he would have his chance. He could wait. He had waited before. He had waited for hours, for days, for however long the shot required. Patience was not a virtue for snipers. It was a survival requirement. His thumb brushed against the rosary beads in his apron pocket, and he whispered words that no one else could hear. Still here, brother. Still trying. Watch my windage. The seconds stretched into small eternities as Elias lay motionless behind the rifle. To the observers, nothing appeared to be happening. The old cook was simply lying there as I pressed the scope, his body so still that several people began to wonder if he had fallen asleep or perhaps suffered some kind of medical episode. General Ashworth checked his watch with growing impatience. The NATO delegation was shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A German colonel leaned toward his British counterpart and muttered something about American theatrics. But Elias was not sleeping. Elias was working. Behind the scope, his mind was performing calculations that would have taken a computer several seconds to complete. Wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, temperature gradient, humidity, the Coriolis effect at this latitude, the spin drift of the bullet over 1,800 meters, the precise angle of the target, and how it would affect point of impact. Each variable slotted into place like pieces of a puzzle he had been solving his entire adult life. The mathematics were not difficult. They were simply precise, unforgiving of error, demanding absolute attention to details that most people would never notice. The flags at the edge of the range snapped and fluttered in patterns that told him everything he needed to know. The dust devils forming on the distant hillside revealed the thermal currents rising from sun-baked rock. The grass between his position and the target bent and swayed in waves that mapped the invisible architecture of the air itself. He could see it all. He had always been able to see it all. It was the gift that had made him what he was, the curse that had defined his existence, the talent that had filled his nights with the faces of everyone he had ever killed. Master Sergeant Okafor lay beside him, her rangefinder pressed to her eye, her body unconsciously matching his stillness. She had stopped questioning why she was here. Something deeper than reason had taken over, some instinct that recognized a master at work and demanded that she bear witness. Wind is holding at 12 from the east, she said quietly, gusting to 15 at irregular intervals. I'm not seeing a clean window. Elias did not respond. He did not need to. He was watching the same wind she was watching, but he was seeing something different. He was seeing the pattern beneath the chaos, the rhythm beneath the randomness. 30 seconds, maybe less. At the edge of the crowd, Master Chief Corbin ended his phone call. His face had gone pale, the color draining away as if someone had pulled a plug. His contact at Quantico had found the records. They had required authorization from a 2-star general to access, and what they contained had made the historian's voice shake as he read the highlights aloud. "Oh my God," Corbin whispered to himself. "It is him. It is actually him." He began pushing through the crowd toward General Ashworth, his movements urgent, his eyes fixed on the old man lying behind the rifle. He had to tell the general. He had to stop this before it went any further. Not because the shot would fail, but because of what it would mean if it succeeded. The sniper community was small. Stories traveled fast. If Spectre was still alive, if he was here, if he was about to demonstrate that his skills had not faded despite 33 years of retirement, the implications would ripple through every special operations unit in the Western world. General Ashworth saw Corbin approaching and frowned. He did not appreciate interruptions, especially not during what was already shaping up to be the most bizarre moment of his 30-year career. "Master Chief, what is it?" Sir Corbin said, slightly out of breath. "Sir, I need to tell you something about that man." He pointed toward Elias, who remained motionless behind the rifle, seemingly oblivious to everything except the distant target. Ashworth's frown deepened. "If you're going to tell me that our cook is actually some kind of secret sniper, I'm not in the mood for jokes." "Sir, this is not a joke." Corbin's voice was tight with urgency. "I just got off the phone with the historical division at Quantico. They had to pull records that required 3 levels of classification clearance. And?" Corbin swallowed hard. "That man is Master Gunnery Sergeant Elias Roundtree. Retired. Call sign Spectre." The name hung in the air between them. Ashworth blinked. "Spectre," he repeated slowly. "Yes, sir. Force Recon. Scout Sniper. 31 years of service across 3 wars. His confirmed kill count is classified at levels I do not have access to. His operations are classified at levels that most generals do not have access to." Ashworth turned to look at Elias with new eyes. The old cook in the stained apron. The man with the trembling hands and the shuffling walk and the hearing aid that he always complained about. "You are telling me," Ashworth said carefully, "that the man who has been cooking my breakfast for the past 12 years is one of the deadliest snipers in Marine Corps history." Corbin nodded. "Sir, he is not one of the deadliest. According to the records I just accessed, he is the deadliest. His record has never been officially broken because most of it has never been officially acknowledged." On the ground, Elias's finger tightened almost imperceptibly on the trigger. The window was opening. He could feel it before he could see it. The thermals were aligning. The gusts were about to pause. 3 seconds of stillness in an ocean of chaos. Bishop's voice whispered in his memory. "Now, Spectre, take the shot." The wind died. It happened exactly as Elias had predicted, exactly as the mathematics had promised. The gusts that had been tearing across the rain for the past hour suddenly fell silent. The flags that had been snapping and cracking went limp against their poles. The grass between the shooting position and the distant target stopped swaying and stood perfectly still. 3 seconds, maybe 4. That was all the physics would allow before the chaos resumed. Elias did not hesitate. His body moved with the automatic precision of 53 years of muscle memory, his finger completing the trigger pull that his mind had initiated before the window even opened. The rifle barked once. The sound rolled across the training ground like thunder, echoing off the distant hillside and returning in waves that seemed to take forever to fade. Every eye on the range tracked the trajectory they could not see, the invisible line connecting the old cook's rifle to a target that most of them could barely identify through their own optics. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. The doubt began to creep in. At 1,800 meters, even a perfect shot took time to arrive. But surely they should have heard something by now. Surely the metallic ring of impact should have reached them. 3 seconds. General Ashworth opened his mouth to speak, to declare the experiment a failure, to order the old man back to the kitchen where he belonged. And then the sound came, a distant ping, almost musical in its clarity. The unmistakable ring of a high-velocity round striking steel at nearly 2 kilometers away. It was a sound that every sniper on that range knew intimately, a sound that meant only one thing. Dead center. The silence that followed was unlike anything Elias had experienced in his 79 years of life. It was not the silence of an empty room or a quiet morning. It was the silence of 50 people simultaneously losing the ability to process what they had just witnessed. Master Sergeant Okafor lowered her rangefinder with hands that had begun to shake. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Confirmed hit. The words broke the spell. Sound returned to the world in a rush of exclamations and expletives in half a dozen languages. The French commandos were on their feet, shouting questions at each other. The British SAS candidates were pushing forward, trying to get a better view. The SEAL instructors who had been standing at the edge of the range were moving toward the shooting position with expressions of pure disbelief. Elias remained where he was, prone behind a rifle, his cheeks still pressed against the stock. His breathing had returned to normal. The world was expanding again, filling back in with sounds and sensations that had been blocked out during the shot. His hands had started trembling again. The old cook was returning, sliding back into place like a mask being lowered over a face that should never have been revealed. But it was too late for masks now. Staff Sergeant Decker stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, his face cycling through emotions faster than his mind could process them. Disbelief, confusion, the dawning horror of realizing that he had laughed at someone who deserved nothing but reverence. He had told this man to go back to the kitchen. He had threatened to have him dragged off the range by MPs. He had dismissed him as a confused old civilian who did not understand his own limitations. And now, that confused old civilian had just made a shot that none of the assembled elite snipers had been willing to attempt. General Ashworth walked toward Elias with slow, deliberate steps. His mind was still catching up to what Master Chief Corbin had told him moments before, still trying to reconcile the classified legend with the humble cook who had been serving him scrambled eggs for over a decade. He stopped beside the prone figure and looked down at the old man who had just saved his exercise from disaster. Master Gunnery Sergeant Roundtree, he said quietly. Elias turned his head slightly, his ancient eyes meeting the general's gaze. The use of his rank should have startled him, should have triggered some reaction. But he was too tired for surprise. He had known this moment would come eventually. He had simply hoped it would come later. "Sir," he replied, "how long have you been cooking on my base?" 12 years, sir. And in all that time, you never thought to mention that you were one of the most decorated snipers in Marine Corps history?" Elias slowly pushed himself up from the prone position, his joints creaking audibly in the sudden quiet. He reached down and picked up his apron, which had come untied during the shot, and began folding it with the careful precision of someone who valued order in small things. "With respect, General," he said softly, "I was not a sniper for those 12 years. I was a cook. The sniper retired a long time ago." He tucked the folded apron under his arm and looked at the distant target, now invisible to the naked eye, but burned into his memory like a brand. He just had not forgotten how to shoot. The crowd pressed closer, a wall of uniforms and questions and demands that seemed to close in from every direction. Elias could feel their eyes on him like physical weight, the scrutiny of 50 elite operators who were suddenly seeing him for the first time. He could have walked away. The thought crossed his mind with surprising clarity. He could have nodded to the general, tucked his apron under his arm, and shuffled back to the mess hall kitchen where his beef stew was almost certainly ruined by now. He could have returned to invisibility, to the comfortable anonymity of being the old cook who made good biscuits and never caused trouble. 12 years of peace. 12 years of hiding in plain sight. All of it was slipping away with every passing second, and part of him desperately wanted to grab it back before it was gone forever. But another part of him, a part he had thought long dead, was waking up. The French commandos had reached the shooting position first, their earlier mockery replaced by rapid-fire questions about wind calculation and thermal compensation. The British SAS sergeant who had noticed his breathing control was asking about training methodology. The SEAL instructors wanted to know about his service record, his deployments, the operations that had earned him a call sign that still echoed through Special Forces communities 3 decades after his retirement. Master Gunnery Sergeant Rountree. The name spread through the crowd like wildfire, passed from mouth to mouth in tones of disbelief and dawning recognition. Several of the older observers were pulling out phones, searching databases, making calls to contacts who might confirm what they had just witnessed. Elias stood in the center of it all, his folded apron clutched against his chest like a shield. The tremor had returned to his hands. His joints ached from the prone position. He looked exactly like what he had been for the past 12 years, an elderly man who belonged in a kitchen, not on a sniper range. But the shot had changed everything. The shot could not be taken back. General Ashworth raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent with the automatic obedience of military personnel responding to rank. "Give the man some space," he commanded. "All of you step back." The wall of bodies retreated reluctantly, opening a circle around Elias and the general. The international observers remained in their seats, but their attention was absolute. Whatever happened next would be reported to their respective governments within hours. Ashworth studied the old man before him. The stained apron, the orthopedic shoes, the hearing aid that Elias was now adjusting with fingers that would not stop shaking. Nothing about this picture made sense. Nothing about this moment fit into any category that 30 years of military service had prepared him for. "Why did you do it?" Ashworth asked finally. His voice was quieter now, stripped of command authority. This was a genuine question from one human being to another. You could have stayed in the kitchen. No one would have known. No one would have asked. "Why did you step forward?" Elias was silent for a long moment. His eyes drifted to the distant hillside where the target still stood, invisible but unforgotten. The wind had returned, gusting across the range in patterns that his mind automatically cataloged even now. "Because they were going to fail," he said finally. His voice was soft, almost lost beneath the wind. "Because I watched those young Marines standing there, the best shooters their generation has produced, and not one of them could make that shot. Not one of them was willing to try." He looked at Ashworth with eyes that had seen more death than most people could imagine. "I have watched Marines fail before, General. I have watched them die, because someone who could have helped chose not to. I have buried friends who should have lived and carried guilt for men I could not save." He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his apron pocket where Bishop's rosary beads waited. "I cannot watch it happen again. Not when I could do something about it." Ashworth nodded slowly. The answer made sense in a way that transcended military protocol or operational security. It was the answer of a warrior who had never truly stopped being a warrior, no matter how many years he spent hiding behind a spatula and a serving line. Master Chief Corbin stepped forward, his phone still clutched in his hand. "Sir, I have additional information from Quantico. The records they pulled are extensive. This man's service history spans 3 wars and 4 decades. His confirmed operations include extractions, Overwatch missions, and direct action assignments that changed the course of multiple conflicts." He looked at Elias with something approaching reverence. "They have him listed on the memorial wall at Quantico, sir. His name is included among the greatest combat marksmen in Marine Corps history. And according to the records, he has been presumed dead by most of the special operations community for the past 30 years. The words settled over the crowd like a shroud. Presumed dead. The ghosts had been cooking their breakfast all along, and none of them had ever looked closely enough to see. Presumed dead. The words echoed through the silence that had fallen over the range. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He had not meant to disappear. When he retired in 1991, he had simply wanted to stop. Stop killing. Stop calculating. Stop waking up in the middle of the night with his finger twitching against an imaginary trigger. He had filed his paperwork, collected his pension, and walked away from everything he had ever known. The special operations community had its own way of handling legends who vanished. When years passed without contact, when no one could locate him through official channels, When even his former teammates lost track of his whereabouts, the assumption became official. Spectre was gone. The ghost had finally become a ghost for real. He had not corrected them. He had not reached out. He had simply let the legend die while he built a new life with Clara, a life of quiet mornings and evening walks and tomatoes growing in the backyard garden. And when Clara died, when that life crumbled to dust, he had retreated even further. A cooking job on a military base. A small apartment in the housing complex. An existence so unremarkable that no one would ever think to look for a legend there. General Ashworth broke the silence with a voice that had lost its commanding edge. 30 years. You let the entire special operations community believe you were dead for 30 years. It was not a question, but Elias answered anyway. I was not trying to deceive anyone, sir. I was trying to forget. He opened his eyes and looked at the general with an expression of infinite weariness. Some of us do not want to be remembered for what we did. Some of us just want to stop. The crowd had gone completely still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the very air was holding its breath to hear what would come next. Staff Sergeant Decker pushed forward through the ring of observers. His face had gone pale, the confident aggression of earlier replaced by something that looked remarkably like shame. Sir, his voice cracked on the word. Master Gunnery Sergeant Roundtree, sir, I owe you an apology. Elias turned to look at the young man who had laughed at him, who had threatened him with MPs, who had dismissed him as a confused old civilian who needed to return to his kitchen. I treated you with disrespect, Decker continued. His hands were clasped behind his back in the rigid posture of someone delivering a formal statement. I mocked you. I tried to have you removed from this range. I had no idea who you were or what you had done for this country. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. I was wrong, sir. I am sorry. The apology hung in the air between them. Elias studied the young staff sergeant for a long moment, seeing in him echoes of himself from half a century ago. The same confidence, the same certainty, the same inability to see past appearances to the truth beneath. Staff Sergeant, Elias said quietly, you did your job. You saw an unknown person approaching a restricted area, and you moved to intercept. That is exactly what you were supposed to do. Decker shook his head. Sir, with respect, I did not just intercept you. I laughed at you. I told you to go back to your kitchen. I treated you like you were nothing, because that is what I wanted you to see. Elias's voice was gentle, almost paternal. I have spent 12 years building that appearance. The trembling hands, the shuffling walk, the old cook who makes good biscuits and never causes trouble. You saw exactly what I wanted everyone to see. He reached out and placed a hand on Decker's shoulder. The touch was brief, almost hesitant, as if he had forgotten how to make contact with another human being. Do not apologize for being fooled by a deception I spent a decade perfecting. Just remember this feeling. Remember what it taught you about assumptions and appearances. And the next time you see an old man who does not seem to belong somewhere, maybe look a little closer before you decide he has nothing to offer. Decker nodded, his eyes bright with emotion he was struggling to contain. Yes, sir. I will remember. General Ashworth watched the exchange with an expression that had shifted from confusion to something approaching respect. Whatever he had expected from this bizarre interruption to his exercise, it was not this. It was not a lesson in humility delivered by an elderly cook who had just proven himself to be one of the deadliest men on the planet. Master Gunnery Sergeant, he said formally, on behalf of this command, I want to thank you for your assistance today. Your shot saved this exercise from failure and prevented significant embarrassment for the United States military. Elias turned to face him. The afternoon sun caught his face at an angle that deepened every line and crease, illuminating the map of decades written across his features. Permission to return to my duty station, sir. The stew is almost certainly ruined by now, and dinner service starts in 4 hours. The request was so mundane, so utterly ordinary, that several observers laughed out loud. The tension that had been building since the shot finally broke, releasing into something lighter, almost celebratory. But Ashworth did not laugh. He recognized what Elias was doing. The old man was trying to retreat, trying to pull the mask back into place, trying to return to the invisibility that had protected him for so long. The general was not ready to let him go that easily. "Permission denied," General Ashworth said. The words stopped Elias mid-turn. He looked back at the general with an expression that flickered between surprise and something older, something that looked almost like fear. "Sir?" Ashworth stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Elias and those immediately nearby could hear. "You have been invisible on this base for 12 years. You have cooked meals for thousands of Marines who had no idea they were being fed by a living legend. You have hidden yourself so completely that the entire Special Operations community wrote you off as dead." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I'm not going to let you walk back to that kitchen and pretend this never happened. Not today. Not after what I just witnessed." Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "With respect, General, I did not ask to be seen. I stepped forward because the exercise was failing and I could help. The exercise is no longer failing. My help is no longer required." "Your help," Ashworth replied, gesturing toward the distant target that still stood as silent testament to the impossible shot, "was extraordinary. And these men and women deserve to understand what they just witnessed." He turned to address the assembled crowd, his voice rising to carry across the range. "What you saw today was not luck. It was not a fluke. It was the result of 53 years of dedication to a craft that most of you have only begun to understand." The observers fell silent, their attention locked on the general and the elderly cook who stood beside him with obvious discomfort. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Elias Roundtree served this country for 31 years, Ashworth continued. "He fought in Vietnam, in Beirut, in the Gulf War. He conducted operations so classified that most of them will never be acknowledged. He trained generations of snipers who went on to train generations more. And when he retired, he did not seek glory or recognition. He sought silence." Elias stared at the ground, his hands trembling at his sides. This was everything he had spent 12 years trying to avoid. The attention, the reverence, the weight of a legend being placed back on shoulders that had grown too old to carry it. Master Chief Corbin stepped forward again. "Sir, if I may add something." Ashworth nodded. Corbin turned to face the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in the Special Operations community. "I spoke with the Historical Division at Quantico. They pulled records that required 3 separate levels of classification clearance to access. What I learned in that conversation changes everything I thought I knew about the history of American military marksmanship." He looked at Elias with an expression that bordered on reverent. In 1983, this man held a position in Beirut for 31 hours after the barracks bombing. Alone, with 2 bullets in his shoulder. He eliminated 17 hostiles who were trying to reach trapped Marines in the rubble. 47 Marines survived that day because of his actions. A murmur ran through the crowd. Several of the older observers exchanged glances of recognition. They had heard of that operation. They had studied it at training schools. They had never known the name of the sniper responsible. In 1991, Corbin continued. He attempted to reach his spotter during an ambush in Iraq. Corporal Winston Tate, call sign Bishop, had been wounded during extraction. Enemy fire made the position untenable. Master Gunnery Sergeant Roundtree was forced to watch his best friend die from 400 meters away while providing covering fire for the evacuation helicopters. Elias's hand moved to his apron pocket. His fingers closed around Bishop's rosary beads, the worn wooden crosses pressing into his palm like anchors holding him to the present moment. He retired 6 months later, Corbin said quietly. According to the records, he never fired another shot in combat. He never accepted another assignment. He simply walked away and let the world believe he was gone. The silence that followed was profound. Every person on that range understood loss. Every one of them had buried friends, had carried guilt, had wondered if there was something more they could have done. But few of them had experienced the specific agony of watching a brother die through a rifle scope, helpless to intervene. Master Sergeant Okafor spoke into the silence. Her voice was thick with emotion she was struggling to control. "I trained under one of your students," she said to Elias. Staff Sergeant Dominic Waters. He talked about you constantly. He said you were the reason he became a sniper. He said everything he knew, every technique, every calculation, he learned from a man called Spectre. Elias looked up at her. His eyes were bright with moisture he was fighting to contain. Dominic, he said softly, good kid, made sergeant faster than anyone I ever trained. He died in Fallujah, Okafor replied. 2004. An IED. But he talked about you until the end. He told his team that if they ever met a man called Spectre, they should thank God they were on the same side. The rosary beads bit into Elias's palm as his grip tightened. Another name, another ghost, another student who had become a warrior, who had become a memory. Still here, brother, he whispered under his breath. Still losing them. The sound of a vehicle approaching cut through the heavy silence that had settled over the range. Every head turned toward the access road, where a black SUV with government plates was moving at speed toward the training area. Dust billowed behind it in a plume that caught the afternoon light like a signal flare. General Ashworth frowned. He had not requested any additional personnel. The exercise was technically complete now, the impossible shot having salvaged what the technical failures had nearly destroyed. The SUV came to a stop at the edge of the range, and a figure emerged from the back seat. He was older, perhaps mid-70s, with silver hair cropped close to his skull in the military style and a bearing that announced decades of command authority. His uniform bore the insignia of a colonel, but the ribbons on his chest told a story that outranked any number of stars. Colonel Richard Vance walked toward the gathered crowd with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned long ago that authority did not require haste. His eyes scanned the assembly until they found what they were looking for. They found Elias. The old cook had not moved from his position near the shooting station. His apron was still tucked under his arm. His hands were still trembling. But something in his posture shifted when he saw the colonel approaching. A straightening of the spine, a squaring of the shoulders, the unconscious muscle memory of a lifetime of military discipline. Vance stopped 3 meters away. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The assembled observers watched in confusion, uncertain what new development this represented. Then Colonel Vance saluted. The gesture was crisp, precise, executed with the perfection of someone who had rendered honors thousands of times over a career spanning 5 decades. His hand rose to his brow and held there, trembling slightly with the effort of maintaining the position. A colonel saluting an enlisted man. A colonel saluting a cook in a stained apron. The breach of protocol was so severe that several of the younger observers gasped audibly. Elias returned the salute with equal precision. His hand did not tremble. For that single moment, the old cook disappeared entirely, replaced by the warrior who had earned that salute through blood and sacrifice and 31 years of service. At ease, Master Gunnery Sergeant Vance said. His voice carried the roughness of age and emotion. It has been a long time. Elias lowered his hand. Yes, sir, it has. Vance turned to address General Ashworth and the assembled crowd. His voice was strong despite his years, trained by decades of briefings and commands. In 1985, this man single-handedly provided overwatch for a covert extraction of American hostages in Beirut. The operation was classified at the highest levels. It does not exist in any official record. What I'm about to tell you, I'm authorized to share only because the relevant files were declassified 18 months ago. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the silent crowd. Master Gunnery Sergeant Roundtree held his position for 31 hours with no food, no water, and 2 bullets lodged in his left shoulder. He neutralized 17 hostile combatants without detection. When the extraction team arrived, they found him still at his post, still providing overwatch, still refusing to abandon his mission until every hostage was confirmed safe. Vance's voice cracked slightly on the next words. I was one of those hostages. I was a captain then, captured during a reconnaissance mission that went wrong in every way a mission can go wrong. I spent 11 days in a basement, wondering if anyone even knew I was alive. He turned to look at Elias with eyes that glistened with moisture. And then the shooting started. And then the shooting stopped. And then a medic was cutting my restraints and telling me that we were going home. I did not learn until years later that one man was responsible for making that extraction possible. One man who held a position that should have been held by a squad, who made shots that should have required a team, who bled for 31 hours so that 6 Americans could see their families again. The silence on the range was absolute. Even the wind had fallen still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. "I have been looking for you for 30 years, Vance continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every veterans organization, every retirement community, every lead that might tell me what happened to the man who saved my life. And all this time, you were here, cooking breakfast for Marines who had no idea what they were eating beside." Elias met the colonel's gaze. His own eyes were bright with tears he refused to shed. "I did not do it for recognition, sir. I did it because it was the mission, because those were Americans in that basement, and getting them home was the only thing that mattered." Vance nodded slowly. "I know. That is what makes it extraordinary. You never wanted thanks. You never sought credit. You just did the impossible and then walked away as if it was nothing." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, metallic, glinting in the afternoon light. "I have carried this for 30 years, he said, waiting for the day I could return it to its rightful owner. He opened his hand to reveal a challenge coin, worn smooth by decades of handling. On one side was the insignia of Force Recon. On the other, a single word etched in letters that had faded but never disappeared. "Spectre." "This was in the rubble of my cell," Vance said. "It must have fallen from your pocket during the extraction. I have kept it with me every day since, as a reminder of what one man can accomplish when he refuses to quit." He pressed the coin into Elias's trembling hand. "Welcome back, Master Gunnery Sergeant. Welcome back from the dead." Elias stared at the challenge coin in his palm. The metal was warm from decades of being carried close to another man's body. The edges had been worn smooth by countless moments of handling, of remembering, of wondering what had happened to the ghost who had made survival possible. He had not even known it was missing. In the chaos of the extraction, in the fog of blood loss and exhaustion, a single coin had slipped from his pocket and landed in the rubble of a Beirut basement. And for 30 years, it had served as a talisman for a man whose life had been saved by a stranger in the darkness. "I thought you were dead," Vance said quietly. "When the years passed and no one could find you, when even the intelligence community lost track of your whereabouts, I assumed the worst. I thought maybe the bullets had finally caught up with you somewhere, or that the weight of everything you carried had become too much." Elias closed his fingers around the coin. The weight of it felt like an anchor, something solid in a moment that had become increasingly surreal. The weight almost did become too much, he admitted. His voice was barely audible above the wind that had begun to stir again across the range. "After Bishop died, after I retired, I spent years trying to outrun what I had done, what I had seen, what I had lost." He looked up at the colonel with eyes that held no pretense, no defense. "I met a woman named Clara. She saved me in ways that no mission ever could. And when she died, I came here. I thought if I could just be near Marines again, if I could just hear the rhythm of it without being part of it, maybe I could find some kind of peace." "And did you?" Vance asked. Elias considered the question. The honest answer was complicated. The peace he had found was fragile, conditional, dependent on maintaining an invisibility that had just been shattered beyond repair. "I found something," he said finally. "I do not know if peace is the right word, but it was enough. It was enough to keep going." The crowd had remained silent throughout the exchange, witnesses to a reunion that transcended anything the training exercise had been designed to produce. The international observers sat motionless in their seats. The sniper teams stood in clusters, their earlier competitive tension forgotten. Even General Ashworth had stepped back, ceding the moment to forces larger than rank or protocol. Master Sergeant Okafor moved forward slowly. She stopped beside Colonel Vance, her eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that spoke of something she needed to say. "Master Gunnery Sergeant," she began. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, clasped tightly behind her back to hide their trembling. I need you to know something about Dominic, about Staff Sergeant Waters. Elias looked at her. The name still hurt. Every name still hurt. He kept a photograph in his kit. Okafor continued. A picture of his graduating class from Scout Sniper School. He showed it to everyone, pointed to the instructor in the corner, the one who was not looking at the camera because he was scanning the tree line even during a photo op. She paused, gathering herself. He said that man taught him everything. Not just how to shoot, but how to think, how to calculate, how to see the world the way a sniper needs to see it. He said that man was the reason he believed he could make a difference. Okafor's voice broke slightly on the next words. When Dominic died, they found that photograph in his pocket. It was the only personal item he carried on every mission, the only thing that mattered enough to keep close. Elias felt something crack inside his chest. The wall he had built over decades of loss, the barrier that kept the grief from overwhelming him, developed another fracture. I remember that class, he said softly. Dominic was the youngest. Everyone thought he was too small, too quiet. But he had eyes like a hawk and patience like a stone. I knew from the first week he would be something special. He was Okafor confirmed. He was the best sniper I ever worked with. And he learned it from you. The weight of legacy settled over Elias like a physical thing. All those years of training, of teaching, of passing on skills that would outlive him. He had tried to walk away from it. He had tried to let the legend die. But the legend had continued without him, carried forward by students who became teachers who became memories. Staff Sergeant Decker stepped forward again. His earlier shame had transformed into something else, something that looked like determination. Master Gunnery Sergeant, he said formally, I know I've already apologized, but I want you to know that I will never forget what you taught me today. Elias looked at the young man. What did I teach you, Staff Sergeant? Decker swallowed hard. That the most dangerous person in any room might be the one you least expect. That appearances mean nothing. That age is not a limitation. It is an accumulation. He straightened to his full height. And that when everyone else is afraid to step forward, sometimes the only hero available is the one who has already given everything and still finds more to give. The words hung in the air like a benediction. Elias felt the challenge coin pressing in his palm, felt Bishop's rosary beads against his hip, felt the weight of every shot he had ever taken and every life he had ever saved. For the first time in 33 years, he did not feel like a ghost. He felt like a man who had finally been seen. 6 weeks later, Elias Roundtree was still cooking breakfast at Fort Navarro. He had refused every offer that came after that day on the range. The speaking requests from military academies across the country. The interview opportunities from journalists who had somehow learned about the legendary sniper hiding in a mess hall kitchen. The documentary proposals from production companies eager to tell the story of Spectre's resurrection. The invitation to return to Quantico as a guest instructor to pass on his knowledge to a new generation of marksmen. I am too old for that now, he had told Colonel Vance when the offers began flooding in. Besides, these Marines need to eat. But things had changed in ways that could not be undone. The Marines who passed through the mess hall now looked at him differently. Not with the dismissive glances of people observing an elderly cook, not with the casual indifference of those who saw only a stained apron and trembling hands. They looked at him with something deeper, respect that bordered on reverence, gratitude that needed no words, recognition of a debt that could never be repaid. Staff Sergeant Decker came by every morning before breakfast service began. He arrived at 0530, sleeves rolled to his elbows, ready to help set up the serving line and prepare the dining area. No one had ordered him to do this. No regulation required it. He simply showed up day after day, working alongside the man he had once tried to remove from a rifle range. They did not talk much during these early morning hours. Decker asked questions sometimes about wind calculation or trigger discipline or the mental preparation required for impossible shots. Elias answered when he felt like it, his soft voice carrying wisdom that no training manual could capture. Mostly they worked in comfortable silence, two Marines separated by 50 years, but connected by something that transcended age or rank. Master Sergeant Okafor had become a regular dinner companion. 3 times a week she appeared in the mess hall after the evening rush had ended, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a willingness to listen. She told Elias about her students, about the challenges of training young snipers in an era of technological dependence, about her fears that the fundamental skills were being lost to computerized targeting systems and drone warfare. Elias listened more than he spoke. But when he did offer guidance, Okafor absorbed every word like a student receiving sacred instruction. She had begun incorporating his techniques into her curriculum, crediting the lessons to a source she described only as the best marksman I ever met. The shot itself had entered the training materials at Quantico. New snipers studied the conditions, the calculations, the impossible geometry that Elias had solved in seconds while lying on a range in a cook's apron. They did not know his name yet. The classification levels were still being sorted out, the bureaucratic machinery of military secrecy grinding slowly toward eventual disclosure. But they knew the shot. They called it the Spectre shot. One evening, as autumn began to paint the trees around the base in shades of gold and crimson, Elias walked to the small chapel near the housing complex. He had not been inside a church since Clara's funeral, had not felt the need for the quiet contemplation that such spaces offered. But something was pulling him there now, some unfinished business that had waited long enough. He sat in a back pew, alone in the fading light that filtered through stained glass windows. The colors played across the wooden floor in patterns that shifted as the sun descended toward the horizon. He pulled Bishop's rosary beads from his pocket. The wooden crosses were warm from being carried against his body, smooth from 33 years of contact with his skin. He held them the way he had held them on 1,000 sleepless nights, feeling the weight of memory and loss and love that they represented. "I think I understand now," he whispered into the empty chapel. His voice echoed slightly off the stone walls. "You kept telling me to stop running. Stop hiding. You said I could not help anyone from the shadows." He closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him. "I made the shot, Bishop, not to kill, to save, to show them that the old cook in the kitchen still had something to offer." The rosary beads pressed into his palm as his grip tightened. "I think I am finally ready to stop hiding. I think I am ready to let them see who I was, so they can understand who they might become." He opened his eyes. The stained glass window above the altar depicted a soldier kneeling, head bowed, rifle laid across his knees. He had never noticed it before in all his years on this base. Perhaps he had never been ready to see it. "Still here, brother. Still trying. And I'm going to keep trying until I cannot try anymore." He rose slowly from the pew, his joints protesting as they always did. He tucked the rosary beads back into his pocket, feeling them settle against his hip like old friends returning to their proper place. Tomorrow he would make breakfast for 500 Marines. He would crack eggs and flip pancakes, and make the biscuits that everyone said were the best on any military base in the country. And when the young men and women thanked him for the food, he would nod and shuffle back to the kitchen, playing the role he had created for himself. But they would know now. Word had spread through channels both official and unofficial. The old cook was Spectre. The trembling hands had made impossible shots. The shuffling feet had walked through 3 wars and emerged carrying burdens that most people could not imagine. He stepped out of the chapel into the evening air. The stars were beginning to emerge overhead, pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. He had taught Clara their names during those quiet years between his retirement and her death. He had shown her the constellations, traced the patterns with his finger, shared the knowledge that his own father had passed down to him decades before. Somewhere up there, he liked to think, Bishop was watching. Clara too. All the fallen brothers and the lost loves and the students who had become warriors who had become memories. All of them looking down at an old cook who had finally stopped running from who he used to be. Semper Fidelis. The words rose unbidden to his lips, a promise renewed after 33 years of silence. Always faithful, to the core, to the fallen, to the mission that never truly ended. He walked back toward the mess hall, his orthopedic shoes scuffing against the pavement. Tomorrow there would be breakfast to make. There would be Marines to feed. There would be a legacy to honor, one meal at a time. And that, Elias Roundtree decided, was more than enough. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes do not always wear uniforms anymore, that legends can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember, the person serving you coffee tomorrow, the janitor in your building, the elderly neighbor you never speak to, they might have carried burdens you cannot imagine. Every person you pass has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching.